Hey everyone, and welcome to my first video analyzing the writing style of Terry Pratchett. Specifically, I'll be looking at how Pratchett writes satire, all excerpts taken from his novel, Small Gods. Keep in mind that while Pratchett infuses his signature satirical tone into just about every sentence in this novel, which means there are plenty of excerpts I could have chosen to exemplify this, I've decided to look specifically at how satire creeps into his portrayals of even the most cruel and corrupt perspectives, as I think this contrast makes the techniques he uses more apparent. Allow me to read our first of three examples, which encapsulates the discussion held between two religious zealots wondering what should be done about a foreign country whose religious beliefs differ from their own. Vorbis shook his head. Unfortunately, wild and unstable ideas have a disturbing tendency to move around and take hold. Friet had to admit that this was true. He knew from experience that true and obvious ideas such as the ineffable wisdom and judgment of the great god Om seemed so obscure to many people that you actually had to kill them before they saw the error of their ways, whereas dangerous and nebulous and wrong-headed notions often had such an attraction for some people that they would, he rubbed his scar thoughtfully, hide up in the mountains and throw rocks at you until you starved them out. They'd prefer to die rather than see sense. Friet had seen sense at an early age. He'd seen it was sense not to die. What makes this passage satirical is the irony. The reader, given the context of the book up until this point, is aware that both of these characters are delusional, yet the characters themselves believe there is nothing wrong with their perspective, namely that if a given group of people refuse to live in accordance with the ineffable wisdom and judgment of the great god Om, then the only way to make them see the error of their ways is to kill them. Layered in here, we also see another splash of Pratchett's comedic tone. After all, someone who has been killed cannot actually see the error of their ways. They are dead. Here, you can also see the humorously circular logic of the character Friet, who only sees sense in not dying, and so regards anyone who fights back, say by hiding up in the mountains and throwing rocks at you until you starved them out, as preferring to die rather than see sense being not dying. This reveals that what he considers sense actually has nothing to do with sense at all, but with fear-induced compliance. He is merely justifying his actions to himself. Now, let's zoom in a little closer and look at how Pratchett's word choice highlights the irony of these two characters' beliefs, thus bringing his satirical tone to life. First, alternative viewpoints are regarded as wild and unstable, and their tendency to move around and take hold is seen as disturbing. Next, we have ideas that are known by the reader to be ridiculous, namely those pertaining to the wisdom and judgment of the great god Om, regarded as true and obvious and ineffable. An attempt at perspective then slips through the cracks in the character's delusion with the word obscure. The next word that maintains the satirical tone is actually. It's difficult for me to explain why exactly this is, but try reading the sentence with and without it, and I think you'll see what I mean. Pratchett then uses the adjectives dangerous and nebulous and wrong-headed to describe, from this character's point of view, the alternative religious notions of other cultures, which is ironic because the reader knows that it is this character's ideas that are clearly dangerous and nebulous and wrong-headed. This description, hide up in the mountains and throw rocks at you until you starve them out, then does a great job at conveying the power dynamic at play, implying that even though people who hide up in the mountains and throw rocks aren't much of a threat, we're going to starve them out anyway, simply because they won't adhere to our obscure beliefs. The last word that adds to the satirical tone is the word prefer, as if the people they're killing actually have any sort of preference, when, in reality, they simply don't see any sense in the ineffable wisdom and judgment of the great god Om. Overall, the reader gets the distinct impression here that Pratchett is mocking the perspectives of these characters for being very far removed from reality, but there is also a very tragic element to this satire that makes the reader feel uncomfortable, because we are all too aware that many real-life zealots, religious or otherwise, have and continue to engage in this very sort of thinking, and that persecuting others for holding different worldviews instead of engaging in honest dialogue tends to lead to a great deal of human suffering. All in all, a thought-provoking passage. Let's move on to the second of our three examples, which describes in a satirical tone how the members of this fictitious church become exceedingly pious when expecting the arrival of a prophet. And, as is generally the case around the time a prophet is expected, the church redoubled its efforts to be holy. This was very much like the bustle you get in any large concern when the auditors are expected, but tended towards taking people suspected of being less holy and putting them to death in 100 ingenious ways. This is considered a reliable barometer of the state of one's piety in most of the really popular religions. There's a tendency to declare that there is more backsliding around than in the National Toboggan Championships, that heresy must be torn out root and branch and even arm and leg and eye and tongue, and that it's time to wipe the slate clean. Blood is generally considered very efficient for this purpose. Herein, the Church's behavior when expecting the arrival of a prophet is being compared to how people act when auditors are expected, which is sure to elicit a chuckle from the reader because it's a very relatable comparison to draw, namely how their piety will be subject to the same scrutiny as someone's taxes. There are many satirical elements to this excerpt, so let's unpack it sentence by sentence and highlight the key words, phrases, and comparisons that bring its satirical tone to life. First we have, the church redoubled its efforts to be holy, which is humorous because being holy is supposed to be a given with churches, but at the same time, everyone knows these things tend to ebb and flow. This next sentence makes the auditor comparison, but distinguishes their efforts to be holy from what one might do in the days preceding an actual audit by saying their efforts tended towards taking people suspected of being less holy and putting them to death in 100 ingenious ways. The word ingenious here adds to the satirical tone, contrasting with the horror of putting them to death in 100 ways, as does the phrasing, much like the bustle you get in any large concern, which lends to the prose that distinctly British sense of humor that tends to lighten the mood. The extent to which one puts others to death for being less holy is then referred to as a reliable barometer of the state of one's piety in most of the really popular religions, which mocks the petty, self-aggrandizing nature of many people who operate within corrupt institutions, religious or otherwise, and so adds to the satirical tone. The word really also plays a subtle yet key role in conveying this tone, in a similar way the word actually did in the previous example. Read this passage with and without the word really, and you'll see what I mean. Next, the phrase, more backsliding around than in the National Toboggan Championships, further adds to the mockery of their actions, comparing something they perceive as deadly serious, namely the backsliding of their piety, to something rather whimsical. Within the same sentence, Pratchett then expands upon the common phrase, heresy must be torn out root and branch, by introducing the reality of what that often entails, saying, and even arm and leg and eye and tongue. Then Pratchett makes a mockery of their actions one last time by describing how their intention is to wipe the slate clean, but they do so using blood, something that is notoriously unclean. Consider this phrasing, too. Blood is generally considered very efficient for this purpose. These two words, generally considered, may not be necessary for the logic of the sentence, but they're included to maintain the satirical tone. It's difficult to explain why this is, as certain elements of writing are very difficult to logically deconstruct. But as is the case with the other two words I've mentioned, if you read the sentence with and without these words, I think you'll understand. One is a blunt sentence, and the other describes a widely accepted belief. I'll go through this last excerpt a little more quickly, but I wanted to include it because it differs from the first two in its subject matter, using satire to discuss cruelty more broadly, as opposed to the variety engaged in by corrupt religious institutions. The labyrinth of Ephebi is ancient and full of 101 amazing things you can do with hidden springs, razor-sharp knives, and falling rocks. There isn't just one guide through it, there are 6, and each one knows his way through 1/6 of the labyrinth. Every year they have a special competition when they do a little redesigning. They vie with one another to see who can make his section even more deadly than the others to the casual wanderer. There's a panel of judges and a small prize. And here and there, set high in the tunnel roof over the more ingenious traps, are observation windows, because guards like a good laugh as much as anyone else. First off, the deadly traps hidden in this labyrinth are described as 101 amazing things you can do with hidden springs, razor-sharp knives, and falling rocks, the key word here being amazing as opposed to gruesome or horrible. The passage goes on to describe how the Labyrinth Guides host a competition where they redesign the traps to see who can make his section even more deadly than the others to the casual wanderer. The satirical tone is then brought to the forefront when it's mentioned that there's a panel of judges and a small prize, and again later on when it's mentioned that there are observation windows above the more ingenious traps, quote, because guards like a good laugh as much as anyone else. Again, note how the word ingenious is used to describe the traps, and not a word like deadly or ruthless. Anyway, I hope you found my analysis of Terry Pratchett's satirical techniques useful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And as always, like and subscribe for more technical writing videos.